All right. Thank you, Anna. It's great to meet everyone. So, my name is Ava, and I'm really happy to be here with Scott today, like talking about this wonderful topic. The title of the salon, which make sure I get it right, is Becoming Fully Human. And when we were planning what would be the best topic to talk about, Scott and I both felt that it's so interesting how creativity is such a big part of feeling fulfilled, where for so many people, it seems like a really critical part of how they derive meaning and just like fulfillment. And yet, like the creative path is so hard to pursue because it's filled with kind of rejection and feeling like you're not good enough. And as someone who currently full time makes a living writing a Substack and has been working on a novel for the past couple years, that's definitely something I think about a lot. Where like being creative has been so wonderful and life changing, but at the same time, like it's kind of a path that's like rife with new challenges. And so I just kind of wanted to have a conversation about that and like see how everyone else felt about it. And I know Scott's written like multiple books touching on these topics, and it's something that he also thinks about a lot. So very curious for him to share his wisdom with us too. Scott, do you have any introduction you want to make?
Oh, that was wonderful. Well, introduction. I'm humanistic. I'm a cognitive scientist by training. So I started off studying the brain and mind and intelligence and trying to redefine intelligence and IQ and all that. And then I got bored with that topic, and I discovered that there was a scientific investigation of creativity and fell in love with that field. And then, as creative people do, I got bored with the scientific study of creativity. And so I then discovered the field of self-actualization and transcendence. And that's kind of my most recent chapter incarnation, which is nearing that end as well, and moving on to something else. But that was a chunk of 5-6 years, and integrating intelligence, talent, creativity, self-actualization, transcendence, integrating all these things. And what does that higher level integration look like is something really interesting to me right now. And I run the Center for Human Potential, which is kind of that is my next sort of thing, is being more of like a businessman now, and being a CEO of the Center for Human Potential, and creating a coaching program. So what I'm really excited about right now is creating a new coaching program I call self-actualization coaching. And we're building up a training for that. I feel like our discussion today is just so relevant to a lot of these things on my mind right now. Like, even how do we like coach people to be creative, and stuff like that. So anyway, thanks so much for having me here. And I'm also a humanistic psychologist, I wanted to say. So I like calling myself a cognitive scientist and humanistic psychologist, because that's a really small niche of people who combine those two things. So that's my intro.
Yeah,
Take it
just
away, Ava.
what'd you say? Sorry, missed that.
Take it away, Ava. Like in the 50s, they did "Take it away, Sam." Yeah.
Definitely. One question I had for you just right off the bat, and first, later, hopefully other people can chime in, is just, we kind of just talked a little bit about how critical like creativity is as like a part of self-actualization. And I know that in your most recent book, you kind of talked about how like when it comes to like, Maslow's research, he believed that like we first achieved safety, like, we had a good support system and felt safe. And then afterwards, like kind of creativity was what we kind of like naturally lean towards. I just want to ask, in your opinion, like, why is it the case? Like, why are we so wired to naturally like seek meaning and being creative?
That's a really wonderful question. I don't know if I agree. I think that that's our default state. I would actually make the case that certainly we're wired for creativity, but we're actually more deeply wired to deal with our safety concerns first. And that is what actually inhibits our creativity. That's actually what, from a hierarchy of needs perspective, that we evolved to be very, very awareness and scanning our environment about how much things are predictable in our environment, because our brains really are prediction machines. So I think that we constantly have this tension between multiple ways we're wired, so to speak. I don't even know about that expression, wired for something, even though the title of my book was Wired to Create. I'm like still skeptical that we should have called it that. It's not something that's like hardwired in, right? Like I really do think, I taught a creativity class at Columbia, and I had this football player who the first
Oh,
class
baja el volumen.
what do you say? Did someone say something? Oh, sorry. I thought I heard of someone say something.
Someone has their mic on. I think that was Ada. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, and like on the first day of class, like this football player was like, "Well, I'm not wired to create," and I was like, "Just to stick with it. Just like open your mind to the possibility that you could be." And like, yeah, by the end of the semester, he was like my most creative student. So I think it's important to recognize, we all kind of have these potentialities within us. Maybe not to the same degree. Is everyone capable of genius? I would probably say no. And I've studied genius, but genius and greatness is a whole different topic than just being the creative mind. Not a whole different topic, but it's not exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And yeah, I think it's like that's a really good distinction where obviously I don't think we expect everybody to become Mozart or like achieve greatness, but it seems like so many people are happy just kind of once they've achieved sufficient safety, like being able to kind of just being creative in their own way, in their own life, like whatever form that takes. I see that Julia was asking a question about how you can create your own safety. So I was curious if like either Scott or anyone else just had thoughts about like the relationship between safety and creativity and how that's shown up in their own life. Because yeah, it's definitely something that's affected me. And I'm sure many of you guys are creative in your own lives and life. And I'm curious about how like that interplay happens.
Should I raise a sign or can I just speak?
I think you just speak, and if anyone else talks at the same time, we'll take turns, but go ahead.
Okay, great. Yes, so I know the topic very well from improv theater, where you start on stage and you are in survival mode the first times because everybody's looking at you and there's no plan and no security net. And then you're just panicking the first times and you scream some random stuff out because you're so in panic and adrenaline. And then you slowly learn to create your own feeling of safety, and especially with this amazing attitude in improv theater where everything is welcomed with your yes and attitude. And this is something that taught me a lot, safety, feeling of safety. It doesn't matter what I say, I will not be punished or thrown out and or worse. This practicing acting with just the feeling, oh, nothing is happening, there's no threat, taught me a lot in improv theater, yes.
Shall we do a skit together?
Oh, I would love to.
Where did you study? Can I nerd out with you for a second about improv? Because I love improv.
Yeah, sure.
Where did you study? Was it a group? Yeah.
Yes, so I did study in Munich, in Germany. I practiced improv also while educating myself as a coach, because you need a lot of improvisation in coaching in Austria. So I'm usually from Austria. And then I use it in therapy forms because of this turning off of your survival fears, of your neurotic error detection mechanism in your brain. So this helps a lot of people. And I still learn from improv daily. So yeah.
I love that. I just became a faculty recently at Second City Improv in Chicago. I haven't made an announcement yet to the world, but our center is going to co-teach a class with them on the improv for self-actualization. Yes. So this is very up my alley, and that's a course any of you could take, by the way. This is going to be up on our catalog next year. So I'm co-teaching it with the artistic director of Second City, and we're just doing like a true 50-50 collaboration to try to like figure out how improv can help with self-actualization in our lives. So I'm so glad you brought that up. Huge potential there, and also huge potential for the kind of kids I work with on neurodiversity. So I'm also like consulting with them about how kids in the autism spectrum can have a greater sense of self-worth by doing improv, because a lot of them are really funny. But everyone in school bullies, so many people bully them for being socially awkward. And I want to reconceptualize social awkwardness as social creativity. So that's one of my hobbies, is reconceptualizing that. Is anyone in this room socially awkward other than me? Hello, am I the only one? Come on.
Is there anybody who isn't? Would be my question.
Yeah, but they're
If so, how do
boring.
you do it?
I've encountered people who aren't actually, but they're like, they bore me. Hi, y'all.
Hey, here they added the lower hand button, which is nice. Yeah, it's really fascinating with improv, and this today's topic is so much up my alley because with COVID hitting, I didn't have a job. I'm a tour guide by profession and just didn't have an industry to work in. And I took this decision to basically do whatever is creative and kind of gamble on myself and go out there in the world. And for the longest time, I was plagued mentally with this thought that, I can't neglect the money thing, right? And how to do that. And of course, that already puts me it tells you something about my status of privilege that I can do that, of course. But still, I'm not a millionaire or anything like that. And what I noticed about this journey, and it's been 2 years, and I have a podcast now as well. I'm hoping to have a studio as nice as yours. It's really interesting how the thought about, and I see Vincent in the chat here saying, making a link between the need to predict and creativity, that I find that that creativity, you have to be safe, like you say, in the sense that creativity is kind of like, I imagine it a lot like the octopus that has kind of more neurons outside of its brain, more into its tentacles, and kind of looking into these nooks and crevices and really feeling comfortable with going to a lot of dead ends, and this just can't happen when you're freaked out about getting to the place where you should be, where the money is, whatever. And any thought that is kind of so focused on a very, very specific goal like that is actually harming the creative process. And does this show up at all in neuroscience work, in brain scans, anything like that? Because I have a feeling that we need to be open-minded and just creating for creating's sake. And then there's also a good chance that's going to pay down the road, but there's no guarantee.
It sounds like maybe you're describing the neuroscience of openness to experience, which is a general personality trait that we all differ in, just like we differ in introversion, extroversion. We differ in conscientiousness, we differ in agreeableness, we differ in how neurotic we are. We differ in how open we are. And the scientists, by scientists, I mean me, I published a paper showing that the area of, we'll have no false humility here. We found that the openness to experience part of the trait was actually correlated with a brain network that scientists have called the default mode network. But it's I've renamed it the imagination network because it's much sexier than default mode brain network. But the imagination brain network is in the medial part of our brain, of our prefrontal cortex mostly, whereas like there's a real beauty to the way that I think that the architecture of the brain is, in the sense that whoever designed that was a genius, because the lateral part of the brain, the outside, is really of the prefrontal cortex, really associated with kind of our outer awareness and our ability to focus our attention on the outside world. But if you slice open a brain, the medial part of the prefrontal cortex, the imagination network where we daydream, tends to activate areas of the medial surface on the inside. That's kind of beautiful in a way, aesthetically and poetically and philosophically, the way that the brain is organized in that way. And openness to experience is really correlated with that rich inner world. rich inner life. And I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, or getting any information relevant to your question, but you just, when you were talking, it made me think, just for its own sake, that's often what the openness trait is for. There's no goal. It's not, it's the non-goal yet goal-oriented personality trait, because people who score high up the kazoo in conscientiousness, they're the ones that are obsessed with goals. I mean, does anyone know anyone who's like, here's 10 ways to hack your lifestyle, and wake up at 6 a.m. every day, and pop your supplements. Oh my God, and like, those people score high in conscientiousness, but are they really open to the beauty of the unexpected, the unknown, the beauty of beauty, and that's openness to experience. Yeah. Sorry, I may have gone too far there.
No. And I like what you asked about whether the big five can be changed, because I definitely feel like, I think you're totally right, Scott, where like openness to experience seems like to be the quality I see most in prolifically creative people. And I think even in the call before the salon, like you, me, and Anna were discussing how like we'd all been very open to risk, like in our lives, and being open to risk was what allowed for that creativity. I do feel like people can become more or less open to risk over time. I don't know what factors make it that way, but maybe it's something like, going back to the safety thing, feeling comfortable enough to accept potential failure. Where I felt like there were, earlier in my life, I was very scared of failure and rejection. And like that was something that made pursuing creative work really difficult, because, it's rife with rejection. Like if you want to write, if you want to do anything like that, you expect to be rejected 100 times before you succeed. And for a lot of people, that's just not something they can tolerate. It's kind of like in improv, like you have to be comfortable enough with like something falling flat, or your joke not being funny, or a skit not working out, before you can actually make good art. And I think maybe as time went on, I became more willing to accept that, hey, like if failure happens, it's not that bad. And that kind of unlocked a lot of my ability to like write more. So I do feel like that kind of increased openness seems to happen for some people. For other people, they seem to like close up more, right? Where, maybe you experience rejection or sometimes some kind of big heartbreak, and you're like, I don't want to try anymore to do what I'm doing. Like, I don't believe I'm talented. Like, I don't want to risk this. And so it seems like some people become more open over time and some people become less. And that really affects your ability to be creative.
I love what you just said, and that was really insightful. I just linked to a study in the chat window where they looked to see what happens if you try to make people more open to experiences, and they did the experiment. And I think there's a broader point, which is that the best way for personality change is not when an experimenter forces you to change your personality. You have to really intrinsically want to, and it'll backfire if someone forces you. So for instance, if you're a huge introvert and your friends are constantly like trying to force you to go out more and come on, just be more sociable, that'll backfire, and you'll end up, so striking that fine balance. This could be another topic for discussion later today, is what is the fine balance between self-acceptance and the desire to change? Because the research I've shown finds that if you go too far in the direction where you stop accepting who you are and you try to change who you are too much, it actually backfires. So just wanted to bring that up.
Actually, I wanted to jump in. Eva, you kind of like already summarized what I wanted to ask you, but there's some elements here that I'm still fascinated about and would love to cover, which is the question of neuroticism. When we talk about the big five, we always try to increase our conscientiousness without becoming boring, and increase our openness without becoming jerks. But we don't really want to touch the neuroticism. It feels too sensitive, and it feels like a kind of powder barrel that you should just not touch.
No, that's why we should touch it.
I know, yeah, that's what we'll be doing. But I think one of the people who do write about this is Eva, and you wrote a lot about how learning to manage your neurotic like instincts or responses actually enabled you to not just to be creative, but to be happy. And what I love in your writing is this kind of element of surprise or admission of surprise that, you just started experimenting with these different methods, and then suddenly it was just gone. And suddenly you couldn't remember the last time when you felt that kind of overwhelming anxiety or shame that I think is very familiar to a lot of creative people. And by creative, I mean, in the creative bucket, I also include people who make their lives, right? Like a lot of people don't just create art, they create a life, and they deviate from like prescribed paths, and that's an act of creativity. And then you kind of have to face the world and learn and iterate and face rejection. And so I would love to hear more about this, and also from Scott, what the scientific or theoretical frameworks are around these personal experiences, that people at some point are just like, enough of me having one bad experience and that ruining my year. Let me that be just like maybe a bad hour from which I learn. What is there brain science behind this? I'm sure there is. And if so, how does that work, and how can we make it more widely known and available?
And it's a great question. Yeah, I'll try to talk about it and then let Scott talk. But yeah, something I think about a lot as someone who, grew up, I think, scoring quite high on the typical Big Five neuroticism scale, is like, I think for me at least, being neurotic was both good and bad. It was good in the sense that it really encouraged me to analyze everything and like overthink. And like, I feel like a lot of like writing is that, it's like analyzing, overthinking, and like, like really going over your experiences instead of just kind of like metabolizing them and moving on. So like, there's some element I always say of like, I guess if you use something creative for a living, you're probably not completely psychologically healthy, because there's some reason you want to like make art about your life, and that's like a source of motivation. I think in a lot of ways.
Don't tell them. Like, you guys are all crazy.
Yeah, but yeah, I really think that being neurotic can be really good in some ways. But at least for me, like the way I grew up was like, I was just so anxious that it was really hard for me to accept imperfection. And I think that accepting imperfection is a big part of like being able to keep writing, because you have to bridge the gap between what you're making now and what you hope to make. And if you can't accept what you're making right now and put out in the world, then to some extent you can never improve, right? Because you'll always be like, oh, like, I'll write more when it's better, or I'll publish or share it when I'm like happy with it, and then you're never happy with it, and then it kind of becomes a trap. And so I think for me, like just doing a lot of experimentation, and I write about this in my Substack, around like therapy, psychedelics, like trying different things to decrease my anxiety, was something that like really helped change my life. And I think the method is different for everyone, but I do think that in my life, kind of around 2-3 years ago, there was kind of a turning point where I suddenly felt like, oh, the worst case outcome is, and obviously there are the financial pressures and logistical pressures of the creative life, but I realized the thing I feared most was actually like in my mind. Like it was really like my own fears that were stopping me. Like it wasn't really any like logistical thing that stopped me from being able to like prolifically write. And so once I had that realization, I was able to write like regularly. I was like, oh, I can write every day and share some of it. And that really made the difference. And so I think there's something about like decreasing neuroticism to the point where you're like, I can accept what I'm making and put it out in the world. That's so important. And like how everyone gets there is probably so different.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, just wanted to add something about the anxiety and creativity. I think for people that have anxiety problems, the creativity can be difficult in some way, because you don't have a scale or scores in creativity. Like you can be creative and it can be like it doesn't have any measures. It's so open. It's like no limits there, and so you don't have limits, so you don't know if you are doing right, if you are doing well, and like it's quite difficult to know if you are good in it. And well, in this case, you just have to believe in yourself and believe that you are good, or wait the approval of the others. So I don't know, I just see this thing between anxiety and creativity, something linked, and probably when you have anxiety problems, it can be more difficult for you to be creative. Just want to tell this.
Well, psychologists certainly try to measure creativity, but I like your definition of creativity much better, Karina, as no limits. Holy cow. Psychologists try, and then they capture, and they look in the brain, and then I've used the creative achievement questionnaire in my research that measures what is your level of creative achievement and what you've accomplished in your life. But you know, you were so right when it comes to well, who would agree with you? What's the famous painter's name? Picasso said, you often don't know where you're going until you get there. And I think that's the key to creativity, is it emerges. And I think that's an excellent point. I have a lot more to say about neuroticism and mental illness. I have so much to say, but I don't want to talk so much. So let's hear the other people's thoughts.
Yeah, Quinn?
Well, oh yeah, I was just going to jump in with a question. I also put it in the chat room, but one of the things I'm kind of curious about is, well, I think right now in the conversation, we're talking a little bit about kind of like how to change your personality. Like, I think, you know, the topic of this conversation is about creativity. I presume a lot of people in this room are interested in like cultivating that skill. But I wanted to follow up on something that you brought up earlier, which is that sometimes that like desire to change yourself actually might be destructive, right? Like it could actually be a self-destructive tendency. And this is primarily for Scott, but I was kind of curious about your take and the room's take on like, how do you go about that in a healthy way? Or like, when is that desire to change potentially actually a problematic thing? I'll pause there.
Well, there are biological temperaments that we have. Genes matter. Biology matters. I mean, I'm not, you know, that's controversial to say that sometimes these days. But you know, we're born with certain potentialities and what biologists call reaction ranges. But you know, the point is we never know. We don't have direct access to what that reaction range is. So we have to really try, and we have to really see what our limits are and where our potentialities are. But I think to live a healthy life, it's the path of self-actualization requires having deep acceptance of what you can't change, and so that you can mentally start embracing it. And you know, it'd be like telling people in the autism spectrum, you know, like, oh, biology doesn't matter, just be neurotypical, like just change. You know, and like people on a lot of people on the autism spectrum have a celebration of being on the autism spectrum. They're gonna be like, fuck you. Like you're saying that I need to change to be some other standard, you know? So I think that I move in the path, when in coaching, I actually move more in the path of helping people be more who they are than to be something else. And in fact, Abraham Maslow, my favorite psychologist, has a great quote, which I'm trying to find on the spot, frantically Googling it, but something like, we don't try to change a rose into lilies, we try to make a rose into a good rose. And that's what I really think that it's more about in life is, you know, become the best Julia P in the whole world. You know, there's no greater Julia P, you know, like that you can do. You do have potential to be the best Julia P in the history of the universe. So why not shoot for that goal?
So the funny thing is my middle name is actually Lily.
Oh my God. That's perfect. That's so perfect. Yeah.
Maybe that is a nice transition into the point. By the way, Quinn, I think your question is amazing and would definitely like to get into that, but I think my response might be to some other threads. So this is the creativity of the Zoom room that we have. But I thought it was really interesting when Anna brought up neuroticism, because I think I don't consider myself a neurotic person, but then I think maybe there, or not maybe, but I think like within psychoanalysis, there could be like multiple types of neuroticism, multiple types of depression. So like, for example, there's probably like anxiety, neuroticism, depression about others / anxiety, neuroticism, depression about yourself. And I think within psychoanalysis is like, it's a distinction between like, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, analytic versus introjective. So I'll share the article in the chat, but like analytic is when the patient feels helpless, weak, and fears abandonment, versus introjective is when the patient feels worthless, guilty, and fears loss of approval. And essentially analytic, they derive satisfaction from intimate interpersonal relationships, versus introjective develops from having a stable, realistic, and essentially positive identity. And so again, like interpersonal relatedness, connectedness is what gives them satisfaction, versus like self-definition, autonomy, self-control, identity, germane. And I think that bucket has helped me, because I feel like I am actually very neurotic about the interpersonal side, but less so about like self-definition, autonomy, which is interesting because we're talking about the relationship between creativity and self-actualization. But actually, one of the first things that this conversation brought up was like creating safety in our social environments and like social awkwardness. So I just wanted to bring that up because I felt like, I was like, oh, I'm not neurotic. Actually, I'm very neurotic, but in a different ways that maybe other people experience neuroticism.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on your own unique flavor of neuroticism? I'd love to hear more about what the texture is like for you.
Yeah, I think it's just, and maybe there's more than two buckets, but I think, for example, like I think I have like a very high self-esteem, versus when I've talked to other people who are neurotic, a lot of times it's around like self-worth and self-esteem.
That's right.
But for me, it's like I have anxiety about like, I like overthink my social situations, right? And most of my like sessions with my therapist is rarely about like myself, but about my relationship to others. Versus when I talk to some other people, it's rarely about others, but it's about themselves. So it's just like where does it stem from? Like, is it about yourself or is it about others? And maybe for some people it's both, but I found for me it was mainly about others rather than myself.
Yeah, Zach falls into both buckets, as they just wrote in the chat. You know, it's good to think of personality as a hierarchy, and at the most general level, there's actually just big two. Above the big five, there's a big two. A lot of people don't know that. The big two is plasticity and stability. So for an organism to survive, it really needs both the ability to be stable in the face of threats, internal and external threats, as well as plasticity, the ability to adapt and change. And under that falls out the big five. But underneath the big five are aspects, two aspects, and under each two aspects are factors. So all this is a really nerdy way of saying that what you're describing is all you're saying is that you score high on some factors of neuroticism and not as high on other factors of neuroticism. We have to be very careful not to treat neuroticism like it's a one coherent, like all the constellation of factors that make up the latent trait neuroticism. We have to be very careful to say that doesn't mean that people are going to score high on all of them. It's just like the G factor of intelligence. When we say someone's generally intelligent and we take three people who are generally intelligent, you can't assume this person's just as good verbally gifted than this person, or this person's good visual spatial than this person, even though at the general level, they may score the same score. Does that make sense? So I loved hearing your flavor of neuroticism. It just makes you, what kind of lily is Julia? And that's all you know, you helped us understand the lily that you are. Yeah.
It's
kind of interesting in the big five. We talk a lot about this, and maybe not everybody's familiar, so we will share like a link where you can take the test for free if you want. It's interesting. I mean, the first time you take the test, that out of the 5 areas, like the clustering or the distribution is very, very different. And so you get this kind of composite score of like how open or neurotic or whatever extroverted you are, right? But in some categories, it will be very even and kind of clustered in the same place. And everywhere else, you can be like between 0 and 100, and it can look like somebody's cardiogram, which is also an interesting, I don't know, for me, it was very educational to learn like what are aspects of my personality that are more even, and what are things where it's just like, it's pure chaos, like it's fine, let's just accept and move on. It's very, it was new to me at least, because it's not how usually psych tests work, right? It's much more nuanced.
Yeah, people don't realize, it's so true. People don't realize like you could be extroverted, but actually the 2 main aspects of extroversion are positive emotions or enthusiasm and assertiveness. And you have a lot of people who just score up the kazoo in assertiveness, like CEOs, leaders, but have very little positive emotions, you know? So it's like, but both of them cluster together in the general population. But, and then also take the other one example I want to use is compassion, is the domain of compassion. Actually, agreeableness. Agreeableness comprises 2 components which can come apart. And I think that I'm an example of that. Compassion versus politeness. I cringe at overly polite things. It's just like, it feels fake to me, but compassion is very important to me. And so these 2 things can actually come apart in quite important ways. It's like the difference just between being nice versus being actually caring about someone. You know, there are a lot of fake nice people, you know what I mean? There are a lot of people, they're nice, but when you look beneath the surface, they're really horrible assholes.
At some point, at another salon, we will talk about how come you ended up in LA, because this sounds like it might not be the right place for you. We will talk about that.
Well, I'm bi. I came out as bi recently. I came out as bi-coastal. So I hope to, I hope to really split that. Julie P found that one funny, yeah. So I'm going to be teaching at Columbia again in the fall, and see how I like that. Yeah. I need balance. That's the answer to that question, is I need a balance of extremes.
Elaine, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, if anyone else.
I was going to jump in and say that first of all, I really relate to what Julia said, drawing that distinction between how neurotic you are about yourself versus like relating to other people. And I personally, I think I have a lot of like internal calm and like confidence in myself, and I feel comfortable doing things like being on my own. But when like in some relationships, I think sometimes I over worry, or I think the anxiety comes out, and it's like like being self-conscious, or like overthinking and over analyzing how people respond to you, that type of thing. And I think that's actually, so I actually also write fiction, and I've been writing like for the past 7 years. And I think that actually is what I think when I overanalyze like interpersonal situations, it helps me in writing, because so much of it is about like constructing like these very, I don't know, just because human relationships are so complicated. And I think some of the best fiction kind of brings that out, like all those nuances. But at the same time, I think I'm actually a pretty conscientious person. So being conscientious helps me create the boundary, or I guess like the safety space that allows me to exercise my creativity. So I've been like pretty like consistent with writing every morning for the past 7 years, like an hour, sometimes 2 hours. And it's like my favorite time of day. And it's like the one time where I refuse to do anything else or let anything else get in the way. And yeah, it's like I can be neurotic within my writing, but like the reason I have that time at all is because I'm such a conscientious person.
I love that distinction. I feel like there's something really interesting there about kind of like letting your neuroticism or like kind of the really active part of your brain like show up in your work, but like not necessarily show up in your life. I'm not sure if this, Elaine, this is something you also think about, but I feel like I think a lot about that, where I'm like, oh, like, I definitely feel like just like agonizing about relationships and thinking about interactions. That's something that I like want to lean into when I write, because like I definitely feel like it feeds a lot of my, yeah, just like, characters, writing, how I think. But at the same time, I often have the thought of like, oh, like in life, I want to generally be less anxious about like relationships and interpersonal dynamics. Like I want to be able to like walk away from an interaction, even an important interaction, just be like, I'm happy with how I showed up. I'm not going to spend like 3 hours of my life like thinking about it, even if it's natural for me to do that. So I feel like that's, to me, that's like a very interesting contrast where it's like, something can be very useful in work, but then at the same time, like you don't necessarily always want to feed it like in your kind of like non-work life. And like, I guess like, with every quality, you get both the good and bad from it. And so like, to me, like that's something that definitely shows up where I'm like, I love it when it helps me write, but I hate it when I'm like, it disrupts how I live my everyday life. And I guess you can't have both, or maybe you can. I don't know. I'm trying to find that balance.
Yeah, just to quickly respond to that, I think that's why writing is so therapeutic, because I think without writing or like some kind of creative outlet, I would be a more neurotic person in my day-to-day life. But because like if I have an experience that's a little uncomfortable or even traumatic, then if I'm able to figure out like how can I make art out of it, I actually see it through a different lens, and I am able to take it, I think, less personally and put it past me.
Yeah, I guess one last note on this. One thing I think about a lot is kind of how I feel like in many in many of like my friends' life, I notice that like, for example, their drive towards achievement, like both like helps them and harms them. Where in many creative people, I feel like there's a desire for like creative excellence, like what you were saying about being really conscientious. I feel like I know a lot of creative people who are really conscientious in the sense of like they want to dedicate everything to your work, and that kind of like makes it really hard because you're really critical of yourself and you're always pushing yourself, but also like helps a lot of people like achieve many things in their life, because like, yeah, like if you don't have discipline, you're probably not going to be like sending your work out a lot, and you won't be like waking up at 7 a.m. to write every day. And like, I just like think about Scott, who's like done so much in his life. I'm like, it's so clear that Scott, like you're so driven, and like there must be like some sort of like drive towards that like shows up in many ways. And so maybe there's something where we just have to accept that like a lot of these qualities both make our life easier and harder, where it both enables work and then like sometimes like feels like a burden, but it seems like you can't separate the good and the bad from it.
Yeah, I on
Mr.
that topic.
Buckets.
So like, or Scott, go ahead.
Mr. Both Buckets, Zach Cohen, I'm introduced to you.
Thank you.
Can you read the chat? Can you read in the chat that you're Both Buckets?
Yeah, so I'm a very neurotic person. Always been a worrier, but also very desiring the creative expression and that kind of stuff. So on the thing that Ava was just talking about, I think the balance of like being neurotic or like needing to express yourself, but also not have that happen in your everyday life. I think, there's almost like and like for Scott's success, there's almost like a wall of achievement and neuroticism that like, if it's low enough for you to peek over, there's like a balance of it helps you propel yourself forward in your life and in your creative outlets, but it also doesn't need to deter you from doing those things. So maybe the wall is at a different height at different points in your life, and whereas there's different situations in the other aspects of your life, but I think that's sort of an ebb and flow. But on a separate note, a question I wanted to ask was for those of us who don't like do a creative job full time, but have always been very passionate about different creative outlets and things like that. When I don't engage in creative things every day, I feel guilty. And I'm wondering if there's any advice. I know about the sort of like do a little bit every day, even if you just sit down and, wake up 20 minutes earlier, write one sentence, that's good enough, that kind of thing. Is that sort of the best foot forward in terms of removing the guilt that comes from not creating when you have sort of these high hopes for yourself in that way?
Scott, do you want to comment first? And I can also comment, but want to hear what you have to say.
That's a really deep. It's a really deep topic. It sounds like your neuroticism is not doing you any favors. When I was, I spent many years of debilitating anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. When I think of myself 10 years ago, it's almost comical, but at the time it was not comical. I would eat a piece of pizza and like feel a pang of heartburn and I'd rush myself to the hospital. I mean, it's ridiculous. But none of that was helping me in my creativity. I think that there's this myth. I put a link to the article for the Atlantic I wrote called "The Myth of the Neurotic Creative Genius," because I think there's two separate things. I think there's different things going on, and I don't think that just because you see a co-occurrence of neuroticism and creativity in a person means that the neuroticism is causing their creativity. I actually think that's a battle they're having that can be separate from it. And in your case, it's like you should be overcoming. Well, there's no shoulds, but it sounds like a more productive thing would be overcoming the guilt you feel and the shame you feel when you're not creating, than to work on how you can be creating all the time. But the question as well of how can I create more is also a good question in and of itself, just separate from the neurotic ones. This stuff is so, oh my gosh, it gets so nuanced and complex, and I would want to work on multiple issues. You have multiple buckets that and they're not all correlated. And I think maybe you shouldn't view them necessarily as all correlated, is also a point I want to make. It's not all connected. You know what I mean? Sometimes you really do have inner demons, battles that you have to face and deal with on their own terms. And then you also want to make time for creativity. So there's lots of things to work on. That's why it's fun to be alive.
Zach, I feel like I really, oh, sorry. Oh yeah. I'll just finish and then hopefully I'm not interrupting anyone. But I think Zach's kind of problem is something that definitely I really empathize with, because I felt for many years that I was doing a really bad job at making time for writing. Like at the time I was like working in tech. I wasn't really writing at all. And I was kind of haunted by the sense of like, when I was a child, I had this like such a clear relationship with my own creativity. I just felt like very creative, very prolific, like obviously as a kid, but there's a sense of like, just like free flowing creative energy. And then kind of like from the time I was a teenager onwards, like to my early 20s, like I just was busy with school, was busy with work, and then just felt like too stressed out to basically ever write. Like I wrote only like probably a couple times a year when I really had time, and then like often felt like I was laying myself down, like laying down my child self. But I think looking back, I feel like I think Haruki Murakami has talked about this kind of idea of like there are different times in your life, and like there's a sense of like maybe right now is not the right time in your life for you to write every day or pursue it full time, but that doesn't mean there won't come a time or that you can't make a time for yourself. Like I think like looking back, like that would have been a useful thing for me to internalize, because there did come like a point a couple years later where I had more time and space in my life and I started like writing every day, and that's kind of when it became more viable to do it as a full-time thing. But I think that was a natural product of me just kind of having more space in my life to do it. Like I wasn't as busy with work at that point, and that's what enabled it. But I think I probably felt a lot of guilt when I was more stressed about work, about like, why can't I just like wake up every day and write like 3 pages? Like that's what people tell you to do, right? But like I think at that time it just wasn't the right emotional space for me to be super creative, and that didn't mean there wasn't another time in my life when that would come. And so I think also having some kind of understanding of like, not every time in your life is like the right time necessarily for you to go all in on like making room for creative endeavors. That's true, but that doesn't mean like a time where it's more possible won't come, or at least that was my personal experience.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that resonates a lot. And I also think that the guilt may stem from like comparison as well. Like comparing myself to someone like you, right? Who you've worked really hard for a long time and now you're able to write full time and it's inspiring. But at the same token, it's like, oh, well, if I'm not, pursuing my craft in the same way that someone like you is, like how can I ever get there, right? And I think recognizing the managing energy and managing emotion is just as important as managing time. And yeah, I do get very hard on myself where it's like, I'm in school, I'm working, I'm applying for jobs, like there's a lot of stuff happening. But it's like, oh, well, I haven't written in a while. And like the momentum helps when you are in that state, but when you're not in that state, it feels very like, it's such a hurdle to cross over, right? And I also have a problem with procrastination, right? So this is all sort of related in the way of like, I don't want to fail and I can't fail if I never try. So like, but being open to failure and being open to imperfection is part of the creative process. And I don't want to take that away from the creative process. I think that's an important part of it. That like struggle internally to sort of express yourself. And that's what makes really good art, I think. But yeah, so I appreciate the comments.
Low-level mental illness is actually very productive for creativity. There is research on that. I've published that. If you look at a link in my, I'm trying as fast as possible give you as many free resources as you can to follow up on. But the research shows that the relatives of people with mental illness tend to be much more creative in the general population because they have watered down genes. They, for instance, schizophrenics, relative like children of schizophrenics have that divergent thinking ability, but without the debilitating aspect that the parent has. So, so watered down mental illness is actually wonderful.
I do love that conception. Mental illness, but at a level where we can still function does seem to be like a defining trait for basically all the great creatives of our time, for certain.
Yep.
Nicholas, did you have a question or some?
Yes, that fits perfectly to my topic. AI wrote this moment to me, that's you, when we talked about waters down mental illness. And I completely agree. So I am very obsessive. I think I enjoy creative aesthetics a lot, and I'm also very neurotic. And so what helped me a lot, and what I use now a lot also in improv and teaching improv, is outsourcing neurotic tendencies. So I have these neurotic tendencies in me and I love them from time to time. If they are not about me or personal connections about other people, but about the topic, when I did study, I loved my neurotic tendencies because I was waking up in the middle of the night and thinking about mathematical problems and I have to write down this formula and this, and I could not sleep and I ruminated about the mathematical problems all the time. So what I do now is I change focus. So in Austria, we have a term object-oriented versus subject-oriented. I never found this in English. Maybe it exists in psychology in English, but it means you either focus on yourself or you focus on other stuff, right? And usually when you feel insecure, a lot of people tend to focus on themselves because of survival instinct. But there's also this low threshold, this watered down anxiety, or not even anxiety, but how do you say, passion, nearly excitement. Excitement is the good word. That you have about the topic, and you're nervous, you can't sit still. Oh, and this and this and this. And this we use also in improv, for example, or I use in coaching is, okay, you can use this excitement because it's body energy, it's mental energy, but you can refocus it. You know, you can obsess about yourself being bad on the stage, or you can obsess about the stage itself, about your colleagues on stage, about the aesthetic of the play, how is the melody moving, in which direction. So this is something that helps me a lot, like turning it from subject towards object. And the object can be also a subject, but it means that you put your focus outward on the problem, on the task, on the passion that you have. And then I feel then there's two sometimes conflicting things marry each other. There's neurotic tendencies and creativity. And yeah, this is sometimes what helps me a lot, because, okay, I can refocus my neurotic tendencies on something, programming or creative stuff. And now I speak too much. So I stop now. I become too passionate, you see.
I love that conception of it. Just kind of, I think someone was saying in the chat that, as Zach was saying, like, the difference between anxiety and excitement is often like very like, it's often comes down to like how you interpret it, because both are just kind of like a sense like states of arousal. But I definitely feel like mindfulness and just being able to kind of sit with the intensity of your emotions and like parse them as something that's like, it's in the room with you, but it's not necessarily something that's like bad or overtaking you, and you can use it as energy instead of seeing as like this terrible thing that's happening, has, at least for me, been so helpful. Just kind of like knowing that like things will like induce feelings of anxiety or worry or like feeling really bad, and just being like, okay, like, I am in the room with these feelings, I'm coexisting with them, but also they are not me, and just like kind of letting that pass through. I guess a lot of people, when they talk about creativity, they talk about like being a vessel. And I really like the idea of kind of like being a vessel and like being clear and just like feeling everything, but also letting it pass through instead of just like holding on to all of it. I think like that's how I conceptualize it in my own life.
Yeah, just channeling is healing. This was helped me a lot in improv, in creativity, or in my work. Like this, when you allow channeling, you allow also creative, honest expression without self expectations. Because sometimes we force ourselves, like we start with excitement to work on something, and then the next day, oh, I should write again, or I should program again, I don't know, to improv again, the same as yesterday. But it's bullshit, because we changed. And sometimes our honest creative expression is just blah, gibberish, or sometimes it's a perfect Shakespearean masterpiece, but it doesn't matter, because as long as it's honest, it's always truthful. And then you can always do art. We dream every night. So I think when you are channeling, you can always channel also.
I'd like to, this connects very much with what I was going to add, and which is like, I think that maybe in the beginning, I don't know, but now is a good time as any to like kind of think about what creativity is, and maybe demarcate the difference between creativity and creating all the time, because there is obviously a deep need in us to express ourselves and to be understood and to be accepted. But in a sense, I feel like a lot of the times when we are anxious about, like, anxiety in a sense is doing something that's very uncreative, right? Because you might go back over and over about the same things that kind of make you nervous and that you're freaking out about. With creativity, I mentioned it in the chat, but to me is is our ability to relate to different concepts, right? And if we're highly creative people, in the sense, not that we necessarily produce a lot of things, but we're creative, then that's the ability to kind of relate make quite surprising relationships, right? This is what's happening, as far as I understand, in things like schizophrenia. You find very original ideas about how the world is ordered and so on. Does that sit well at all with the usual interpretation of what creativity might be in psychology or neuroscience?
I'm not sure if Scott wants to comment, but I do think there's something interesting about Eyal, what you were saying about how creativity doesn't necessarily have to mean like creative work, like, you know, painting a painting or writing an essay. It can just be kind of like a creative act, like relating to something in a new way. One thing that always strikes me is that when people write about addiction, or even when they write about anxiety, actually, they often write about it as like repetitive. Like it's the opposite of creativity, because it's like, for example, if you're like an alcoholic, you go back to like the same thing again and again. Like you're not creating anything new, you're like retreading the same pattern. And I feel like the creative act seems fundamentally like the willingness to, instead of repeating something, kind of like interact or look at it in a new way. And like, I definitely think that like even that act in your life, just like a choice to relate to something, someone, anything in a completely novel way, feels to me like a very genuine creative act. And like, you know, it feels like when people are stagnant, that's usually the result of the opposite of that. It's like, you know, leaning into that repetition and kind of like repeating something that's not serving you. And also there are probably like healthy and unhealthy forms of repetition. Like writing every day is probably different from like worrying about yeah, I don't know if anyone else observes that relationship. Anna, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was wondering about this is kind of like this builds on multiple questions that have just been asked. Basically, the relationship between either a neurotypical situation, or even like maybe mentally less healthy behaviors or situations, and the relationship between the individual and the rejection. I had this really interesting conversation back in January with Diana Fleischman, the evolutionary psychologist, who explained to us during lunch how she does not have disgust, like that's kind of like part of her brain is missing. And she proceeded to also explain during like eating how she was going to eat her placenta as a smoothie, and I was like, okay, that's my limit. But it was very interesting. And it was interesting to me because I have had experiences with people where I felt that this person doesn't have the rejection, shame part of their brain really developed. So something that to me would sound like terribly bad feedback, or I would find it very upsetting. They just like, oh, shrug and move on, or they think like, oh, it's your loss. But I've also noticed that there are like, I also have ways in which I take rejection maybe better than the average person, which is probably why I'm a startup founder and my job is to host events, you know, and teach other people how to host events and help them do this with a bunch of strangers, you know, with unpredictable outcomes. And so I see this very much as a spectrum. And I know that there are people who are even more sensitive to rejection than I am. But there are people who are absolutely not. And I'm wondering, how does this correlate with types of mental illness? Like, are there people who have a lot of problems or have so many problems that they just don't have time to deal with shame over rejection and end up just so much more successful and kind of fulfilled in their creativity? And if so, can we learn this? Is there a way to kind of crazy ourselves into being much more anti-fragile when it comes to just other people's random opinion.
We haven't, there's so many topics we haven't discussed, and unfortunately I have to leave in a couple minutes. But maybe I could come back if anyone wanted me to come back. Because the big topic, which I feel like this segues to, which is worth another hour, is the link between narcissism and creativity. Because that's the can of worms I think you're really opening, is particularly vulnerable narcissism, which is extreme sensitivity to rejection. And
everybody's parents are getting a discount, okay? If you want to bring your parents to this, all millennial Gen Z parents are welcome. We will give them 50% discount on the tickets.
Because I think that's the topic there that question kind of brings up is, you know, how to manage vulnerable narcissism when that pops up, because it's a very it's not as an obvious form of narcissism as grandiose narcissism, which everyone knows about, because the person announces it. With vulnerable narcissism, they don't announce it. You know, with the grandiose narcissist, they enter the room immediately and they're like, yeah, I'm superior to everyone. But with vulnerable narcissism, the person stews over fantasies of greatness, and will never tell anyone. You know, and they have shame over it. And then the slightest rejection, they fall to pieces. And they're the ones that tend to end up on the clinician's couch. The grandiose narcissist very rarely ends up on the clinician's couch. They only end up on the couch when their girlfriend, you know, forces them to see therapy, because they're too much of an asshole. But that's really the only time you see that. So it just opens up that whole can.
I love this. And if you have psychologist friends, they will tell you that a narcissistic client or patient is a mind F ... Like, it's so hard for therapists to, because they are charming, they will win you over, you believe them, they are convinced. And it's just, I have a bunch of practicing clinical psychologist friends, and after 3 beers, they will, without going into details, tell you about their own sufferings on the other side of the couch.
Yes, I have these conversations all the time with my colleague W. Keith Campbell, who we published papers together on vulnerable and grandiose narcissism. But he told me all these stories about, he's like, the grandiose narcissists, I mean, they don't, they never enter therapy saying, I need help, right? It's always, I was forced to, look, doc, I was forced to come here by X, you know?
But I'm perfect. I'm just here to confirm that, right? And I'm willing to pay for this.
The problem is really other people. The problem is always other people. And you blame everything, every failure that you have, you blame it on someone else. You project it. But the fear of rejection is a lot of that. Oh, Ava.
I was gonna ask if Ada wanted to ask a question, just so in case she wanted to catch you before you went.
Oh, that's a beautiful suggestion. Yeah, so maybe Ada can be the kind of the last question for while I'm here. Yeah.
Hello all. Yes, it's pronounced Aida.
Aida, hi.
Yes, hi everyone. Hi, it's really nice to be here with all of you. This is finally the first, I guess it's the second salon I've actually caught. So I keep some of my times keep kind of messing up. But this is really helpful, this last point about the vulnerable narcissism. That is definitely something I want to hear a lot more about. I have this fear that I'm actually in that camp, and I'm like, okay, so what do you do about that? Great, I need to know what do you do about that? But I think it relates to some of the things that were said earlier. One thing that's come up for me around creativity is this fear about vulnerability. And so much of my interest in psychology has been because of my own struggles. And so I watch basically every single interview you've ever done, Scott, and it's been incredibly helpful. And I start to make all of these connections that I feel like are actually, oh, these are things I would want to talk about with other people. But within that journey, I don't actually want to, I don't actually like the feeling of being vulnerable like I thought I would. But now the bits that I started writing online and sharing with people on my own, story, it's like, oh no, I actually want to kind of close this off. And so I really wonder, how do people manage this? I don't know if it's just a fear of rejection, but a fear of vulnerability, and worrying about this kind of self-focusedness that comes with like a narcissism, the self-focused nature that can be really harmful, but that also creates the conditions to read and learn about things that would be helpful to other people. And I wonder how people who are on some other side of this and sharing more already have balanced that.
I keep meaning to write a book on vulnerable narcissism and how to help people with that. And the answer is in your question. It's to not be so self-focused. The answer is to, I will leave on this, and then I would look, maybe you could do, can we do an hour again sometime soon, just riffing on vulnerable narcissism?
Let's do it. Yeah. But I don't think an hour will be enough. You know that, right? This is going to be a day-long discussion with multiple meals, break.
No problem. I'll make sure next time I don't have to dash off to a motorcycle class. But I'll leave with this as like a maybe like a little teaser. The answer is transcendence. You know, the answer is like, life is not all about self-actualization. At a certain point in your life, you realize that you're not going to live forever, and what really matters is doing as much as you can that will make an impact on future generations. You know, and in the longer term of humanity. And when you start focusing your attention on that, you become much less narcissistic. Yeah. Thank you for having me, and Ava, thank you for being so awesome, such an awesome host. Anna, for just being awesome human. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm afraid I do have to hop off, but can you send me the chat? Can you save the chat for me? Okay, so if anyone wants to like ask questions in the chat or whatever, I can review it later when I'm back from my badass intro class. All right.
Good luck. Don't break anything, either yourself or the motorcycle. Thank you so much, Scott. And I think we will spend the remaining like 15 minutes or so just maybe like asking more questions, and I will save the chat so we can send that to you, and we can schedule another meetup at some point. Thank you so much for being here.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it looks like we have maybe 10 minutes left, and could just wrap up. Maybe anyone else had any comments or questions? Feel free to jump in.
I'd love to know how many people here have an active creative practice, whether you share it with the outside world or not yet. Can you put your hand up if you're writing, making movies, music? Any of you who think that you will begin soon, something new? Oh, amazing. Okay, so we definitely have to turn this into a series so we can actually like follow the developments and how you guys are blossoming into full-blown creators.
I was going to say, to respond to what Aida was saying around vulnerability and sharing your work, I did struggle with that a lot too. And I think when it comes to like writing like fiction, I just had this assumption that I really shouldn't share until it's like all done and I feel good about it. But the problem with that is it's such a long feedback loop. It's like you just don't know if it's going anywhere until a year or even 2 years later. So I've gotten a lot more comfortable with just sharing like as I'm writing, and as hard as it is. And I think, yeah, there's like actually, I guess like part of it is just being less precious about my work. And I know there's like this quote by, I think, Freddie Mercury, where he says, like, my songs are disposable like Bic razors. And I love that quote so much because it's like, he was just so prolific, and Queen obviously was like one of the greatest bands, but like it just was inspiring to me because I realized you don't have to be so precious about everything you make. Like you could just do something and put it out there, see what happens. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah.
And also the sheer amount of stuff, like we think about like, I don't know, Bruce Springsteen, right? And oh, Bruce Springsteen has all these big songs and all how lucky he is that all of his songs in the 70s and the 80s just went on to become these mega hits. But if you actually read his autobiography, which is amazing, by the way, the guy has been writing 100 songs a month. Like, of course, he has 10 good songs per decade or 20. Like, the output is enormous. So when we saw on Twitter jokes about like, make 100 videos. Like there is like this really deep, there's this really deep wisdom to that. And of course, you need a good community because Bruce Springsteen probably had these 5 guys or girls in his band, and they just like joked around and expected most things to suck. And then they were just like recording all these songs after songs after song after song. And then sometimes, it was great. And I just love that. And I think about that so many times, how we are like, no, prepare and then do one thing and be immediately good. And like, no wonder we stress out. Like that's the most stressful premise I can imagine. Of course, the first 10,000 things will be terrible. Like, how else would I get to the good stuff?
I honestly feel like I started writing on Substack as a way to stay sane because I was working on a longer Fishkin project, which even now is not completely done. And like, there was this kind of sense of like, obviously intense perfectionism with something that's longer and you put a lot of time into. But I think like just having something where, I can write 500 words at a time. I write like a couple times a week and like I put it out there and I know it's not perfect. Like I know on like a weekly basis, it's not perfect, has been really helpful for me because it's like a way.
Sometimes it is perfect what you write. Sometimes.
Oh, Anna. But I think it really it keeps me sane because otherwise, like, I think there's something very important about like getting some kind of like feedback very often. And like, when you're working on something like a novel or something longer, it's like not possible to do that because like it's like so much incompletion. By just thinking that like, if you're writing short stories or sharing essays with your friends, like it's so helpful to like have it out in the world in some way, because then you have the sense of like, oh, like it is out and like I am getting feedback and like it, I think it just makes it like less agonizing. So I feel like whenever friends ask me about like, oh, I want to be more creative, I'm like, you should just like, if you want to like make short YouTube videos or whatever, just like, put things out there and like don't necessarily expect them to be perfect, but just like the act of sharing will like, I know it will keep you sane in some way because you kind of know what you're making, where you're going, and that's kind of like documented in a more visible way, even if you have to live with the imperfection of it.
James Clear said this amazing thing, sorry to jump in just very quickly, that because I also have a Substack for sanity reasons, strictly, and kind of creative fulfillment reasons, and to have like a specific compartment in my life where I put my crazy, so it doesn't go into the other parts of my life. And we were just talking about like book writing versus blog writing or Substack or newsletter or whatever it is that you write quickly. And even James Clear, who I think is a lot of people's role model of like self-control and how well managed he is, right? He was talking about how incredibly difficult it was emotionally to write his book because he was so used to getting feedback. And the fact that you are not getting feedback for 3 years, it's like, and we think like, oh, but back in the olden days, the Charles Darwin was sitting in like wherever, central England and writing his stuff. Yeah, but he was in constant correspondence with a bunch of people. They constantly shared excerpts from their books. Like this thing that we expect today, that the artist goes away into the ivory tower and there they remain for like the duration of 4 years and blah, blah, blah. Nobody ever since the dawn of humanity created that way. Like we are conversationalists. Humans can't even think a thought without discussing it with somebody properly, right? And I think if we figure out a way to get fiction writers back into the cocoon of a community, where there's competition, cooperation, feedback, inspiration, love stories, rivalries, all of the things, I think it's going to remain an excruciating thing that only the extremely masochistic and introverted are able to do.
Yeah, I guess this is what MFA is. Like, I have some friends at like Iowa and NYU, and like they just like talk about how like having, you know, just like workshops and like being in community with like a small cohort of people who are kind of at the same stage as you as a writer, and it's like making work like that you see and they give you feedback on your work seems so helpful. So yeah, I feel like there's really something to that about like just a community aspect. Did Jacob or Karina want to ask anything? I don't want to stop anyone from saying.
I wanted, but I just didn't want to go in front of Jacob. So I just wanted to say how much I relate to what you said about the perfectionism, for example. So, and I think it's so many times it stops us from being creative because I want to do it perfect, and as I'm not sure that I'll do it perfect, so I'll just even don't try do it. And this is sometimes what I feel and what I hear also from my friends, and I think it's a shame because we are losing so much because we even don't try. So yeah, it's really, I think, what we have to try to struggle, I don't know, try to overcome at least. Okay, it's not perfect, but at least you tried. Yeah, it's better this than not even trying it.
Yeah, I think there's something so real about, I forgot who said this, but I think it was a writer or someone else who was talking about how, you know, if you kind of know that you're talented, you can almost get like addicted to the sense of like knowing that you're talented, but also like not really putting work out there, because there's a sense of like, oh, if you don't put work out there or you don't try, you can just like sit with this like idea of like, oh, like, but what I make could be perfect, you know, but then you don't have to confront the possible like failure or mediocrity of what you're actually making. But it's kind of the sense of like, you know, if you don't actually make anything, like you'll never make something perfect, because like everyone has to go through like, you know, the whole hourglass taste gap between what you're making and what you want to make thing. But yeah, it's something I try to remind myself of personally, this idea of like, if I don't make bad work, I can't make good work. So I can't just like sit there and think about the good work I'm going to make. I just have to like go through the bad work. And like, it's not like, yeah, I think it's like very difficult for everyone who does it, but seems better than kind of like sitting there with like the dream of making something one day.
One I think I think one thing that is happening in our culture today is that there are kind of painful or unhealthy solutions to these problems that we are no longer allowed to talk about. For instance, the fact that sometimes you should stay up for 5 days straight and finish writing your diploma or your book or whatever. And yeah, if you just like drag in an extra psychologist into the room, they will be like, oh my God, this is toxic behavior, you need to shut. Yeah, but sometimes, you know. And so I do think that, you know, just kind of to add here, that there are positives to perfectionism, and there are also positives to the jobification of creative work. Like if you talk to a professional theatric actor, like of course they love theater, and of course they want to create the cathartic experience to the audience. That's why they chose this job, but they don't think about the actual day of the work as something necessarily transcendental. They expect the transcendence to happen maybe in a special moment on a special day when the chemistry is right, but they will be like athletes. Of course, athletes strive for grandness and pushing the limits of the human ability. Of course, that's why they're athletes, right? Like otherwise you would not wake up at like 4:30 and run around in a circle unless you wanted that. But what they think about is like the turpentine, you know, like the great painters talk about turpentine, they don't talk about cubism when they meet. Like the athlete, like if you read Agassi's autobiography, he's like, my foot hurts. Here is the things that I put in my shoe so it doesn't hurt. And then I go and win the whatever Australian Open. But like first things first. And the same with actors or musicians, right? They will think about the acoustics, the technicalities of the evening of the show. And I think we should, one thing that we risk losing when we put all our creativity into the hobby level or like side gig, side hustle, we become afraid of turning it into a profession or a trade, like Aristotle, techne, right? Like physical dexterity. And I think that's not just very practical, but also it removes the anxiety, right? Because if you're a librarian and you go in the morning to the library, yeah, of course, it's great that there's all the great literature, but you're not super anxious that, oh my God, I'm going to work all day in the vicinity of Tolstoy. You will be like, 3 cars have gone missing and these kids are not bringing back the books, right? Like you're very practical. And I keep wondering, just for myself as well, like how can I be more orderly and how can I turn some of it into habit? Because that's good. It's not, it sounds boring and maybe some psychologists would jump in and be like, oh no, that's a, but like we all know that there is beauty in the practice. And I think I'm becoming very bullish on that.
And that's so beautiful. I love that. Prishab, did you have anything to say just before we wrap up? Don't want to miss anyone.
Oh, I think I actually just put it in the chat. I was like really resonating with a lot of this because I just moved to New York recently, and there's so many people who are like, yeah, we have this project that's like we've been working on, but we haven't been able to share it, or we don't know if we want to finish it because it's so intimidating going to all these things where like there's so many talented people just showcasing like amazing things. So yeah, we're thinking of like starting this monthly community event starting on August 13th, which is just about sharing that work in progress and like celebrating that and yeah, and like sharing feedback and getting motivation from other people and inspiration from other people who are sharing that vulnerability of being able to share something that's in progress. So if you're in New York and would like to attend, just let me know.
It's very cool. And it looks like we're out of time. So I guess yeah, thank you all so much for coming. This was such a wonderful conversation. I'm glad, yeah, Scott was so insightful. And yeah, I guess some people are sharing their contact information. But otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for coming. I hope that we can all stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Ava and everybody. Take care, guys. Thank you. I'm going to save the chat as well. Bye.